The night Germany realized the Americans were not coming, they were already there. Night falls heavy over northern France. June 5, 1944. The coastal wind howls across the hedgerows and sand dunes of Normandy, carrying the scent of salt and diesel. In the dark, German sentries stand half awake on their posts, gripping rifles slick with mist. Their eyes search the black horizon of the English Channel. Calm, almost too calm. For months they've waited for the invasion, for the storm of steel the Führer promised would come at Pas de Calais. But tonight the Channel is silent. No armada, no thunder of guns, only the rhythmic crash of waves, then faintly, a hum. Engines. Distant, multiplied, ghost-like. Above the low clouds, black silhouettes move, hundreds of them, crossing silently through the night. C-47s, their bellies filled with paratroopers, men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne, faces streaked with charcoal, hearts pounding against the roar of engines. By the time the first German officer lifts his binoculars, it's already too late. The Americans are not coming tomorrow. They are already here, falling from the sky into the heart of occupied France. By early 1944, Europe was a fortress of German ambition, but one cracking from within. For 5 relentless years, Hitler's armies had marched across the continent, spreading the iron grip of the Reich from the Pyrenees to the Volga. Yet in the west, across the narrow waters of the English Channel, a storm was gathering, one that would decide the fate of civilization itself. After the disaster of Dunkirk and the fall of France in 1940, Britain had stood alone. Bombed, starved, defiant. But now the tide had shifted. The Soviet Union was pushing west from the ruins of Stalingrad, and in the Mediterranean, Allied troops had clawed their way up Italy's bloody spine. The Third Reich was still vast but no longer invincible. All eyes turned to the Channel. The question was not if the Allies would invade Nazi-occupied France. It was where and when. For the Germans, the answer seemed obvious. Across the narrowest point between Britain and France lay Pas de Calais, the most logical, direct route to the continent. Heavy coastal guns, concrete bunkers, and endless belts of barbed wire lined the beaches. The Wehrmacht's elite panzer division stood ready just inland, waiting for the invasion that would surely come there. Adolf Hitler was convinced of it. So were most of his generals. But the Allies had other plans. Under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, an operation of unprecedented scale, Operation Overlord, was being forged in secrecy. It wasn't just about soldiers or ships. It was about deception and time. Across southern England, fake armies were built from wood and canvas. Inflatable tanks stood in neat rows. Dummy landing craft lined the harbors. Even fake radio transmissions crackled with orders from a 1st U.S. Army group, a ghost force under the legendary General George S. Patton. The plan was simple in concept, extraordinary in execution, convinced the Germans that the invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. This deception, Operation Fortitude South, would freeze German reinforcements far from the real landing zones and ensure that the first American and British troops hitting the beaches could survive. The first brutal hours. In Berlin and at the German High Command in France, reports poured in from spies and intercepted communications, all confirming the illusion. Hitler's intelligence network, the Abwehr, swallowed it whole. Even when resistance groups and Allied air reconnaissance pointed to strange activity near Normandy, it was dismissed as a diversion. Rommel, commander of Army Group B and one of Germany's most respected generals, sensed danger. He knew the Allies were coming soon. But where? He reinforced the Atlantic Wall, a vast network of mines, bunkers, and obstacles stretching 2,400 miles from Norway to the Pyrenees. Still, he knew it couldn't be everywhere strong. The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive, he warned. For the Allies as well as Germany, it will be the longest day. By late May, the stage was set. The Allies had assembled more than 150,000 troops, 5,000 ships, and 11,000 aircraft, the largest invasion force in human history. Yet only a handful of men knew the precise beaches that would feel the first boots. And on the other side of the Channel, the German watchtowers stood in uneasy silence, confident, perhaps too confident, that nothing could break through the Atlantic Wall. But history was already moving against them. Because on the night of June 5th, As the tides turned and the winds began to calm, thousands of aircraft started their engines across southern England. Men climbed aboard, checking parachutes, clutching rifles. Pilots ran through final checklists. In the shadows of hangars, Eisenhower walked among the paratroopers, quiet, composed, his words few but steady. Within hours, the illusion would end. And the Germans, still scanning Calais, would realize the truth too late. Southern England in early June 1944 was no longer a landscape. It was a war machine. Every road, every field, every harbor was alive with the machinery of liberation. From Plymouth to Portsmouth, convoys of trucks and half-tracks moved in endless columns under the blackout. Tanks rumbled past hedgerows. Barrage balloons floated above like silver ghosts. The air smelled of fuel, salt, and damp canvas. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, over 2 million Allied soldiers had been stationed across Britain. Americans, British, Canadians, Poles, and Free French forces, but it was the Americans of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions who carried the heaviest burden. Their task, to drop behind enemy lines in the dead of night, seize bridges, cut off reinforcements, and sow confusion hours before the beach landings began. They trained relentlessly for it. Night jumps, silent landings, close-quarters combat in the dark. Yet nothing could fully prepare them for what awaited across the Channel. For weeks, their departure point, airfields like Apottery, Greenham Common, and North Witham, had been sealed off from the outside world. Barbed wire fenced them in. Mail was censored. Soldiers were forbidden to leave. Secrecy ruled everything. Codenames replaced places. Orders came sealed in envelopes to be opened only after takeoff. Even the paratroopers themselves didn't know exactly where they were headed until hours before boarding. Then came the weather. By June 3rd, storm fronts rolled across the Channel, drenching the southern coast in rain and wind. Swells rose dangerously high, threatening the fragile landing craft and low-flying aircraft. Eisenhower's planners feared disaster. Operation Overlord could not survive a storm. Inside Southwick House, Eisenhower's headquarters, tension hung thick in the air. Admiral Bertram Ramsay warned that the tides would be wrong if they delayed too long. Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory predicted heavy losses for the airborne drops. Meteorologist James Stagg studied his instruments, weighing the impossible. Gamble with the weather or with history. On June 4th, Eisenhower postponed the invasion. Troops who had already boarded ships were ordered to stand down. Engines cooled. The waiting resumed. For the men, it was agony, each hour stretching like a lifetime. Then on the night of June 5th came the break. Stagg entered Eisenhower's room with new data, a brief window of clearing weather. The winds would ease, the seas would calm, just enough. Eisenhower stood silent for a long moment, pipe in hand. The room held its breath. Then he spoke 4 words that would change the world. Okay, let's go. With that, the invasion was set in motion. Across England, signal lamps blinked to life. Code words transmitted across networks. Neptune is go. Pilots ran to their aircraft. Officers briefed the men on their drop zones, Sainte-Mère-Église, Carentan, and the causeways leading to Utah Beach. The paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, smeared black paint across their faces and checked their gear under red light. The 82nd Airborne, the All-Americans, loaded into their C-47s, nerves taut but ready. They were young, most in their early 20s, but their mission would define generations. Meanwhile, along the French coast, German radar operators noticed the growing interference in their screens. They dismissed it as bad weather. Luftwaffe pilots remained grounded by fog. Rommel, convinced no invasion could happen in such conditions, had gone home to Germany for his wife's birthday. By midnight, the first planes roared off into the darkness. Their engines merged into a single low growl that rolled across the fields and villages of southern England. Each one carried men who might never return, and yet none hesitated. As the first formations crossed the Channel, the pilots saw the moonlight reflecting off the waves, the faint outline of a continent waiting in darkness. France was sleeping under occupation. But before dawn, that silence would shatter, and the Germans, still staring north toward Calais, would soon face the truth. The Americans weren't coming. They were already above them. The human angle, the men who jumped into the dark, for the young men of the American Airborne, June 5th wasn't a night of glory. It was a night of quiet dread. In the dim red light of the hangars, they sat on wooden benches, helmets tilted forward, rifles between their knees, faces hidden behind blackened streaks of grease paint. Outside, the engines of the C-47s thundered like a heartbeat echoing across the airfield. They weren't thinking of strategy or history. They were thinking of home, of mothers who'd kissed them goodbye on small-town porches, of girls who'd promised to write, of the chance, slim as it was, and of seeing another dawn. Many of them were barely 20 years old. Some had never been on an airplane before joining the airborne. But now they would be the first Americans to fight on French soil since 1918. Officers moved quietly between the rows, checking gear. "Don't forget your clickers," they reminded. Small metal crickets, a child's toy turned tool of survival. 2 clicks in the dark would mean friend. No clicks meant enemy. Each man carried over 70 pounds of gear: parachute, reserve chute, rifle, ammo, grenades, rations, and a small escape map sewn into his pocket. When the green light above the hatch finally blinked on, adrenaline replaced fear. At 700 feet, doors opened to the freezing night. Wind howled through the fuselage, and one by one they leapt, silhouettes swallowed by darkness. Below them stretched the patchwork of occupied Normandy, rivers glinting like silver veins, villages shrouded in mist. But the drop zones were chaos. Clouds scattered formations. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from German positions, lighting the sky with red tracers. Many planes missed their marks by miles. Some men landed in flooded marshes, others in hedgerows or directly into German-held towns. Lieutenant Thomas Meehan, commander of Easy Company, never made it out. His plane was hit by flak and exploded in midair. Dozens of others were captured or killed before their boots even touched ground. Yet amid the chaos, small groups began to form. Clusters of men finding one another in the dark, following faint clicks, assembling into improvised units. They were disoriented, outnumbered, but determined. Their mission wasn't to hold ground. It was to cause confusion, to disrupt, to make the enemy believe an entire army had dropped behind their lines. And that they did. By dawn, bridges were blown, roadblocks ambushed, and German communications severed. The American paratroopers had done what no army had ever done before, turned the night itself into a weapon. The technological angle, the machinery of a miracle behind the courage, stood a masterpiece of engineering. The Douglas C-47 Skytrain, a workhorse of American design, carried the war on its wings that night. Each aircraft could haul 28 fully armed paratroopers, or tow gliders loaded with jeeps and artillery. Over 800 of them thundered across the channel in waves so vast that German radar operators thought it was an illusion. They flew in tight formation, a living conveyor belt of men and metal stretching from England to France. Inside, the air was frigid. The roar of twin engines drowned out thought. Pilots navigated by compass, stopwatch, and faith, the glow of phosphorescent paint on their instruments their only light. Pathfinder teams had gone ahead earlier, jumping into Normandy hours before the main drop. Their job was to mark the landing zones with Eureka radio beacons and flashing lights. It was one of the earliest uses of electronic warfare, technology meeting bravery and perfect symmetry. But even the best equipment couldn't control the weather. Strong winds scattered formations. Radio interference jammed signals. The carefully drawn maps in every pilot's cockpit blurred into irrelevance as flak burst around them. Yet through chaos, the machinery of war endured. The gliders, fragile plywood and fabric, carried jeeps, artillery pieces, and medical teams into fields barely wide enough for landing. Many shattered on impact, some slid into hedgerows or stone walls, but each one that survived delivered vital men and supplies into the heart of enemy territory. Radar, too, played a silent part. Allied deception units jammed German radar screens with window. Bundles of metallic foil dropped from bombers to mimic the reflection of massive fleets. The Luftwaffe's operators, overwhelmed, mistook phantom fleets for real ones and couldn't tell where the invasion was coming from. This orchestration of machinery and mind marked a new age of warfare, one where deception, intelligence, and precision were as lethal as bullets. And as dawn crept closer, every hum of an engine and flicker of a radar screen brought Germany closer to the moment of realization. The Americans weren't a rumor in the distance anymore. They were airborne shadows, falling, landing, assembling, already fighting for the liberation of Europe. The enemy angle, a fortress, sleeping, for months. The German High Command had called the Atlantic Wall unbreakable. Concrete bunkers dotted the coast. Mines filled the beaches. Every approach was wired, sighted, and mapped. But beneath the rigid precision of Nazi engineering was a dangerous assumption that their enemy would think like them. In their minds, the Allies would always choose the shortest route, the narrow waters of Pas-de-Calais. It was logical. It was efficient. It was wrong. And so, in Normandy, where the coastline was long and the defenses thinner, many of the German garrisons were second-rate troops, older men, conscripts, and those recovering from wounds. They were competent but not elite. The Waffen-SS divisions and panzer reserves were kept far inland, closer to Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. On the night of June 5, 1944, German radar operators along the Normandy coast saw interference filling their screens. They assumed it was the storm. The Luftwaffe's night fighters were grounded by fog and fuel shortages. Reports from observation posts were dismissed or delayed. At 00:30, the first parachutes began to bloom over Sainte-Mère-Église. Some German officers thought it was an Allied training accident, or perhaps saboteurs dropped by small aircraft. Only after the gunfire began did the scale become clear, but by then chaos had already taken hold. Communications lines were severed. Field telephones went dead. At divisional headquarters, confused messages poured in. Hundreds of paratroopers scattered across miles of countryside. Fires burning in villages, bridges exploding in the distance. Yet even as the evidence mounted, many officers refused to believe it was the invasion. They insisted it was a diversion, a trick to draw their forces away from Calais. And in that stubborn disbelief lay the first true defeat of the night. The Americans hadn't just crossed a coastline. They'd breached the German sense of certainty. The leadership angle, Eisenhower and Rommel, two men, defined this night without ever facing each other. Dwight D. Eisenhower and Erwin Rommel. Their philosophies of command could not have been more different. One a strategist of coalition and patience, the other a tactician of instinct and speed. Eisenhower, calm and deliberate, carried the weight of an entire alliance on his shoulders. For months he had navigated not just battle plans but politics, uniting British caution with American urgency. His genius was not in charisma but in steadiness. On the eve of D-Day, he drafted a note accepting full blame if the invasion failed. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. He carried that note in his pocket when he gave the order to go. Rommel, meanwhile, had built his reputation as the Desert Fox, a master of fast, decisive action. In France, he had tried to apply those lessons to coastal defense. He wanted tank divisions positioned near the beaches, ready to strike before the Allies could establish a foothold. But Hitler disagreed, insisting the armor stay inland until he gave the order personally. On the morning of June 6th, when the invasion finally became undeniable, Rommel was hundreds of miles away, at home in Herrlingen, celebrating his wife's birthday. When news reached him, he rushed back to his command, but it was too late. The chain of command was paralyzed by Hitler's rigid control. No one dared move the panzer divisions without the Führer's approval. That hesitation, those few critical hours, gave the Americans the time they needed to consolidate their fragile positions on the beaches. In modern warfare, time was the rarest resource, and that night Germany spent it on disbelief. The moral angle, deception, and the price of truth. Victory in war often comes not through force, but through illusion. Operation Fortitude, the deception campaign that convinced the Germans of a phantom army under Patton, had been a masterpiece of lies, radio transmissions, fake tanks, double agents feeding false reports. It saved lives, but it also raised a haunting question. When does deception become the real weapon? For the men who planned it, it was an ethical labyrinth. They were asked to manipulate human belief, to exploit the enemy's trust and logic. In the process, they had to deceive not just the Germans, but even their own troops. Most soldiers believed the invasion would strike Calais. Few knew the truth until the last possible moment. But in total war, truth was a luxury the Allies could not afford. Every false radio signal, every inflatable tank, every whisper of misinformation bought the men of the 82nd and 101st A few more seconds of survival. And in the calculus of war, seconds meant lives. The Germans, for their part, had built their empire on deception too. Propaganda, illusion, false certainty. But on this night it was turned against them. The ultimate irony, they fell not to superior firepower, but to superior imagination. As the night deepened and paratroopers fought for control of crossroads and bridges, the moral weight of deception hung invisible over the battlefield. In the quiet between bursts of gunfire, the truth of the war was revealed. Not in honor or speeches, but in the terrible silence between what one side believed and what the other already knew. And by the time the first pale light rose over Normandy, Germany's illusion had shattered. What they thought was a trick had become history. Midnight, June 6, 1944. The skies above Normandy roared with the hum of thousands of engines. From the ground, the sound was otherworldly, a deep, rolling thunder that never stopped. To the men in the C-47s, it was the sound of destiny. Inside one of those planes, Private John Steele of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment gripped his static line, eyes fixed on the red light above the door. His heart pounded against his flak vest. Outside, bursts of flak lit the clouds like black lightning. The aircraft shook violently as the pilots fought to keep course. "Green light," someone shouted. The door opened, and a gale of freezing wind tore through the fuselage. One by one, the paratroopers stepped into the void. The night swallowed them. Below, the French countryside was a blur of fields, rivers, and hedgerows. Anti-aircraft guns from German positions at Sainte-Mère-Église, Carentan, and Pont-l'Abbé fired blindly into the dark. Tracer rounds streaked upward, red and white like fiery threads tearing through the clouds. Many jumpers never reached their drop zones. Some drifted miles off course. Others landed in flooded marshes where they drowned under the weight of their gear. Entire sticks of paratroopers were scattered across miles of enemy territory, isolated and disoriented. But training, and instinct, took over. Small groups began to assemble, using the metallic clickers hidden in their pockets. 2 clicks, friend. Silence, enemy. In the dark, men who had never met formed makeshift squads guided only by compass and courage. At Sainte-Mère-Église, a flare from a burning house illuminated the sky. Paratroopers descending nearby became targets for German soldiers in the square below. Private Steele's parachute snagged on the church steeple. He hung there for hours, feigning death as tracer fire flashed around him. That single image, a paratrooper dangling against the stone cross of the church, would become one of the most haunting symbols of the invasion. Elsewhere, small battles erupted in the blackness. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort and his men of the 505th regrouped under fire, capturing crossroads and bridges vital to the Utah beach landings. Elements of the 101st Airborne seized the causeways leading from the beaches, cutting off German reinforcements. They fought not as organized battalions, but as fragments, scattered, exhausted, yet relentless. By dawn, hundreds of individual skirmishes had woven together into one great mosaic of defiance. For the German defenders, confusion reigned. Their radios crackled with contradictory reports. Paratroopers near Sainte-Mère-Église. No, it's a diversion. Bridges destroyed. Impossible. There's no invasion yet. Each commander waited for orders that never came. The Atlantic Wall, so carefully built, was being outflanked by men who had fallen from the sky. And as the first light of dawn crept over Normandy, something else appeared on the horizon, shadows moving on the water. Hundreds of them, thousands. The real invasion fleet. For the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the truth hit like a hammer. The paratroopers weren't the prelude. They were the signal. The Americans weren't coming tomorrow. They were already here, behind them, beside them, and now, in front of them. Dawn, June the 6th, 1944. The horizon over the English Channel burned orange with the first light of day, and with it came the greatest armada the world had ever seen. More than 5,000 ships stretched from one end of the sea to the other. Battleships, destroyers, troop transports, landing craft, minesweepers, and floating hospitals. The sight was biblical, a moving wall of steel and wake. The Germans, stationed along the coast of Normandy, from Cherbourg to Caen, stood frozen. Some thought it was a mirage. Others dropped their binoculars in silence. Then, the first shells fell. Naval guns from the Allied fleet unleashed a thunder that shook the earth. The beaches erupted. Concrete bunkers splintered, gun emplacements vanished in plumes of sand and smoke. The sea boiled under the impact at Utah Beach. The Americans of the 4th Infantry Division came ashore under relative luck. Strong currents had carried them nearly 2,000 yards south of their intended landing point, away from the heaviest defenses. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., limping with a cane, stepped off the first landing craft and famously said, "We'll start the war from right here." By 0930, Utah was secure. But at Omaha Beach, everything went wrong. Here, the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions faced the full strength of the German 352nd Division, entrenched in high bluffs overlooking the sand. The tide carried the landing craft into a killing zone. Machine gun fire tore through the surf. Mortar shells churned the water into blood and foam. Men drowned under the weight of their gear. Entire platoons vanished before their boots reached dry sand. Captain Joe Dawson of the 1st Infantry described it later. It was like a slaughterhouse, men dying in waves, but somehow, the waves kept coming, still they moved. Inch by inch, using shattered obstacles and the dead for cover, the survivors pressed forward. Engineers cleared mines under fire. Rangers climbed cliffs with grappling hooks. Slowly, the German positions began to break. On the cliffs above Pointe du Hoc, the 2nd Ranger Battalion scaled 100-foot walls with ropes and bayonets, taking out heavy guns that could have decimated the landing zones. By noon, American soldiers were fighting through smoke, rubble, and panic. But they were no longer trapped on the sand. The impossible had become real. Inside the German command posts, disbelief turned to chaos. At the 7th Army headquarters in Le Mans, reports flooded in. Hundreds of paratroopers behind lines, Allied landings on multiple beaches, bridges destroyed, communications collapsing. Colonel Helmuth Meyer of the 84th Corps demanded orders to deploy his armored reserves. But there were none. The message from Hitler's headquarters was chillingly clear. No movement of panzer divisions without the Führer's authorization. And Hitler was asleep. His aides, terrified of waking him, delayed the message for hours. By the time he finally rose and read the reports, the Americans had already secured Utah Beach, and the British and Canadians were pushing inland at Gold, Juno, and Sword. When he finally gave the order to move his panzer divisions toward Normandy, it was too late. The roads were bombed, the skies swarming with Allied fighters. Rommel, racing back from Germany, could only watch as his worst predictions unfolded exactly as he had feared. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's pride, had crumbled within hours. By evening, the beaches of Normandy were a living nightmare and a triumph. Over 156,000 Allied soldiers had crossed the channel. Thousands were dead or wounded, but the beachheads held. Supply lines were forming. Artillery was being unloaded. The foothold in Europe was real. As night fell again over the coast, the sea glowed faintly with burning oil and tracer fire. The sound of engines, gunfire, and human endurance merged into one continuous echo. The sound of history turning. And in that moment, Germany's long illusion finally ended. The Americans weren't waiting across the channel anymore. They were in the hedgerows, in the villages, on the beaches, and by dawn the next day they were already pushing inland. The war in Western Europe had begun again, and it would not stop until Berlin fell. Morning of June 7, 1944. The beaches of Normandy were no longer just sand and sea. They were a graveyard and a fortress all at once. Allied troops were digging in, linking sectors, unloading tanks, artillery, and supplies. Landing craft came in endless waves, bringing fuel, ammunition, and men. The horizon was still gray with smoke, but the message was clear. The invasion had succeeded. In Berlin, the truth arrived like a wound. Reports from France began pouring into Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair. At first, he dismissed them as exaggerations. He was convinced, as his intelligence chiefs assured him, that this was merely a diversion, a feint before the real invasion at Calais. He refused to move the panzer divisions guarding the north. It was a fatal decision. By the time Hitler realized the scale of the assault, it was already too late to respond effectively. The Allies had established 5 connected beachheads, stretching over 50 miles of coastline. Behind them, the airborne divisions, despite catastrophic losses, had secured key roads, bridges and causeways isolating German reinforcements. At Sainte-Mère-Église, the 82nd Airborne had turned a small Norman village into a fortress. At Carentan, the 101st was locking down the routes between Utah and Omaha. What had begun as chaos was now becoming control. Rommel returned to Normandy on June 7th, traveling through the wreckage of destroyed convoys and shattered units. He immediately grasped the enormity of what had happened. "It's the invasion," he told his staff. There's no doubt anymore. But the German command structure was crumbling. Communications between field units were broken. Luftwaffe air support was almost non-existent. The once feared German efficiency dissolved into confusion. Orders lost, reinforcements misdirected. Divisions arriving too late or in the wrong place. Hitler, enraged and sleepless, issued contradictory commands, one moment demanding counterattacks, the next ordering defensive withdrawals. His generals argued, his staff hesitated. The army that had conquered half of Europe was paralyzed by its own leadership. By contrast, the Americans adapted swiftly. Within 24 hours, engineers had built makeshift roads from the beaches inland. Tanks rolled through villages still echoing with gunfire. Field hospitals treated the wounded under tarps and shattered barns. The supply lines, the lifeline of the invasion, were already flowing. At Utah Beach, General Omar Bradley set up a forward command post, directing reinforcements with precision and calm. "The door's open," he told his officers. "Now we push everything through it." For the first time in years, occupied France was hearing the sound of American voices, American engines, American freedom. Villagers emerged cautiously from cellars and barns. Some wept. Others offered wine, bread, flowers. The liberation they had prayed for had come not with speeches, but with mud, sweat, and gunfire. Still, the cost was staggering. By the end of June 6th, more than 10,000 Allied casualties were recorded, including over 2,500 dead at Omaha alone. German losses were harder to count. Entire units had simply ceased to exist. But the moral wound ran deeper. For the first time, the myth of the invincible Reich had been shattered before the eyes of the world. Germany, once the hunter, was now the hunted. And as the smoke drifted inland from the beaches, the realization spread through every bunker and command post from Normandy to Berlin. The Americans weren't waiting across the channel anymore. They had arrived, and they were not leaving. In the days that followed June 6th, the beaches of Normandy transformed into a living organism, pulsing, expanding, unstoppable. The sand that had once been soaked in blood was now a highway of steel. Tanks rolled ashore by the hundreds. Cranes lifted crates of ammunition from ships onto waiting trucks. Bulldozers carved new roads through the dunes, connecting the landing zones into a single vast beachhead. From the air, the view was staggering. Mile upon mile of ships, trucks, tents, and men. An invasion so immense it looked like a second coastline growing out of the first. The Germans tried to fight back. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt ordered counterattacks along the Norman corridor, hoping to drive the Allies back into the sea before they could consolidate. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, filled with fanatical young soldiers, moved toward Caen. Other armored divisions converged from the south, but the skies no longer belonged to Germany. Allied fighter bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts, Typhoons, and Mustangs hunted anything that moved by day. Columns of German tanks burned on the roads before they ever reached the front. Bridges were destroyed by precision bombing. Supply convoys scattered under strafing fire. On the ground, the Americans and British dug in, then pushed forward, hedgerow by hedgerow, field by field. The fighting was brutal and close. Every village, every crossroad, every stone farmhouse became a fortress. The smell of cordite and earth filled the air. At Carentan, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne fought for days to link the Utah and Omaha sectors, enduring mortar barrages and counterattacks that threatened to break their lines. When reinforcements finally arrived, the corridor between the beaches was secure. The invasion zones had fused into one solid front. By June 12th, the Allies had landed over 325,000 troops, 54,000 vehicles, and 100,000 tons of supplies. The impossible had become momentum. In Berlin, silence hung over the Reich Chancellery. Hitler raged at his generals, accusing them of incompetence and cowardice. Yet no amount of fury could reverse the mathematics of war. The Western Front had been reborn. Rommel, exhausted and disillusioned, wrote privately to his wife, "The war is lost. The only thing that can still be done is to end it before total destruction." Within weeks, he would be implicated in a plot against Hitler and forced to take his own life. The moral of Normandy was not just victory but inevitability. The Germans had been defeated not only by force, but by foresight, by an enemy that had outthought them at every level: intelligence, logistics, technology, and leadership. From the beaches, the Allies began their steady advance across France. Towns like Bayeux and Saint-Lô fell. The breakout at Saint-Lô, codenamed Operation Cobra, would soon drive deep into the French countryside and open the road to Paris. Every mile gained was paid for in blood. The hedgerows became graveyards. The air reeked of fuel, smoke, and the weight of history being written in real time, but there was no turning back. By late summer 1944, the Allies had liberated Paris. By the following spring, they were across the Rhine. And less than a year after that first night, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. It had all begun with a lie, a deception that turned into destiny. The night Germany thought the Americans weren't coming was the night they were already landing among them. In fields, villages, and churchyards across Normandy. The echo of that realization would follow the Wehrmacht all the way to Berlin. History often turns not with the roar of victory, but with the quiet realization of truth. For Germany that night, June 5 to 6, 1944, was not simply the loss of a coastline. It was the collapse of certainty. The Reich that had once moved with unstoppable momentum suddenly found itself outmaneuvered, outthought, and outbelieved. The Americans who fell from the sky that night were not gods or legends. They were ordinary men carrying extraordinary faith. They crossed an ocean not for conquest but for liberation. Each one jumped into the dark, trusting that somewhere below lay the first step toward ending tyranny. In war, deception often carries a bitter taste. The Allies built an empire of illusion, fake armies, phantom radios, silent lies whispered across the ether. Yet through that deception came one of the purest acts of courage in human history, because the truth that followed, the liberation of Europe, the fall of Nazism, the return of freedom, was greater than the lie that began it. For the Germans, the realization came too late. When the paratroopers landed, when the first boots hit the beaches, when the first shells struck the bunkers, the myth of invincibility vanished. They had prepared for an enemy that would attack in daylight, by logic, by numbers. Instead, the enemy came in darkness, with silence, precision, and conviction. And from that darkness, a new world began to rise. The invasion of Normandy was not just a military victory. It was the moment humanity reclaimed its future from fear. In every fallen soldier, every burning village, every torn parachute drifting through the night sky, there was a message written in the blood and smoke of history: that tyranny can build walls, but it cannot outlast courage. That deception can delay truth but never defeat it. And that the night Germany thought the Americans were not coming was the night the world began to wake again.